Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this evening for our first public lecture of 2021. My name is Nathan Mannion. On behalf of EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum, you're all very welcome. Before I introduce our speaker, I would just like to let you know that tonight's talk is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. So do feel free to share it with those who couldn't be here tonight. You're welcome to comment throughout our talk in the chat section, but if you have a specific question for our speaker, please do avail of the Q&A function and we will try to address them all at the end. For those who aren't familiar with EPIC, our museum, located here in Dublin, records and shares the stories of the 10 million people who've left the island of Ireland over the last 1500 years, and their 70 million descendants around the world, known as the Irish diaspora. One such emigrant was Laurence Carroll, or U Dhammaloka, a one-time sailor, hobo, Buddhist monk, and anti-imperialist agitator. He is the subject of tonight's talk. Here to tell us more about his memorable life is Dr. Laurence Cox of Maynooth University. Among many other claims to fame, Dr. Cox is the author of Buddhism in Ireland, From the Celts to the Counterculture and Beyond, and along with Dr. Alicia Turner and Professor Brian Bocking, is the co-author of the recently published biography on Damiloka, the Irish Buddhist, the forgotten monk who faced down the British Empire. So without further ado, I will hand over to Dr. Cox, who will begin tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Well, so thanks very much to Nathan and EPIC for inviting me. And thanks to everybody who's come tonight. I'm going to talk for 45 minutes and take questions, comments after that. I'm going to go to a slideshow now, and then I will come back out of that for the discussion. So, let me just, apologies. As Nathan's told you, I'm going to be telling stories basically about this guy. We think he was called Laurence Carroll originally. In Burma and across Asia, he was known as U Dhammaloka. And we're trying to pull together stories. And this is a bit of a challenge because what we have very often is things like the picture on the left. We've got these photos from magazines, records of trials, diary entries, and so on and so forth. And we're trying to pull out of that something that can make a story that makes sense in the modern world. So we're trying to bring it into color, edit it. But we're doing that, obviously, drawing on the stories that he told himself. And here's a couple of stories like that from 1903 in Singapore, when suddenly he returns from Japan, and we're told he's been made Lord Abbot since his last visit. That's the story he's telling. And like most Irishmen, we read, he has a ready tongue, a vivacious manner, and wonderful powers of blarney. He could charm the heart of an owl wheelbarrow, to quote a Celtic saying. And the person writing that is almost certainly the Killarney-born editor of the Straits Times, Edward Morphy. Storytelling is obviously something that we very much associate with being Irish, but it's particularly important then and now if you're a migrant, if you're trying to make your way in a new country, find connections, and if you're poor, if it's one of the few things that you've got going for you, it's your ability to spin a good yarn. And you have to imagine this guy as a hobo, or as a sailor, or even later on sitting around in monasteries around Asia, swapping stories with people. So I'm going to tell 2 or 3 Damiloka stories tonight. And we'll start with one from 120 years ago. So literally January the 20th, 1911, 120 years ago yesterday. Damiloka is in the chief court in Rangoon, there on the right. And there are 2 pairs of Irish eyes in this courtroom because one of them is this Booterstown-born hobo, sailor, Buddhist monk, all-round troublemaker. And the other one is a very senior colonial judge from Carrigtwohill, the Right Honourable Daniel Toomey, who is putting him on trial on charges of sedition. And the reason that the trial happens on the 20th of January, 120 years ago, is because the original trial date, a week before that, the scene had been mobbed. So here on the left, there's a map of Rangoon, and there's the chief court off towards the right, overlooking what was then Fitch Square. It's a bit like Stephen's Green, that sort of layout and look. The whole of poor colonized Rangoon came out to support him in this sedition trial. So the municipal bazaar shuts down. That's the main Burmese bazaar. But so does the Sarati bazaar, which is the Indians. More than half of Rangoon is non-Burmese, mostly Indian migrant workers, Muslims and Tamils working on the docks, because Rangoon is a big port town. Chinatown shuts down. Godwin Road over on the left, right beside his monastery, the Chinese bazaar shuts down. The monks come from his monastery and other monasteries, and the cinema right beside it gives 2 days takings to support him. And the crowds draw Damiloka on the 13th in triumph to the gates of the court, where of course they panic and they go, we cannot possibly hold a trial for sedition under these circumstances. And they put it off till the 20th. And then after the hearing on the 20th, they put off sentencing for another 11 days. So this guy is seriously popular. He's popular enough that the center of colonial power in Burma is worried. So why is this? Well, here's some pictures to kind of explain. Up on the top left, first off, is a beautiful reclining Buddha statue. This is the Buddha at the moment of his parinirvana, his death, which for many years was the first thing you saw when you went into the National Museum on Kildare Street in Dublin. And it had an inscription from its donor, Colonel Sir Charles Fitzgerald, which read something like, "A trophy exhibited to the people of Britain's oldest colony from her newest." Yeah. So it was a piece of colonial loot from the final conquest of central Burma in 1885. And that was a nasty affair. So just below it, you've got a photo of a war crime. These are 2 insurgents, dacoits as they were called, about to be executed in the very nasty little counterinsurgency war that followed the fall of Mandalay. So colonialism has arrived into Buddhist Burma with a bang. But then 15 years later, 25 years later, Burmese Buddhism has responded. It's risen to the challenge. So lower right there, here are monks dressed exactly the same as Damiloka, shaved heads, bare feet, begging bowls, on their way out for the regular morning alms round in a tram, and colorized for a postcard of the day. And above that again, one of Damiloka's own tracts, you can see stamped at or printed at the local newspaper office, the Burma Echo, with its own logo there, the Buddhist Tract Society logo, and churned out in the tens and hundreds of thousands, shipped around on the railways, through the postal system, through a branch network organization. So there's colonialism and there's anti-colonialism, and Buddhism, religion, is in the center of this. And this is what Damiloka is on trial for. Because the key thing that he's accused of saying, and it's something that by 1911, the date of his trial, he's been saying for more than a decade to crowds all over Burma, indeed all over Asia, runs a bit like this. They'll come for you with the Bible. They will come for you with the whiskey bottle. They will come for you with the Gatling gun. So colonialism, in this analysis, it's three things. It's missionary Christianity, it's cultural destruction, remembering that Burmese Buddhists are not supposed to drink alcohol, and it's military conquest. Now, of those three things, challenging alcohol isn't a problem, yeah? You can be a temperance advocate in Ireland, in Britain, in America. It's not politically controversial. You cannot, of course, so recently after the military conquest of the country, stand up and say the British should leave. That's flat out treason. You can't challenge the Gatling gun head on. But what you can do is you can challenge the religion that comes with the Gatling gun. And this is, of course, what Damiloka does as an anti-colonial Buddhist monk. So here's how this trial looks from New York, from the viewpoint of American atheists, in fact, in The Truth Seeker. They say Damiloka's accusers have wealth and religious influence on their side and the media. On the other side is the strength of numbers, justice, and not a little learning. But they are poor. The invaders have money and offices. The natives seem nowhere to have so little say as in their own land. They can't persecute missionaries, but the missionaries can persecute them. And of course, this way of framing things is a very Irish way of framing things, because Damiloka is an heir to what by 1911 is almost a century of an increasingly Catholic framing of nationalism, which plays on the fact that the colonial power both has to seem to be neutral, it has to offer some respect to native religion, but on the other hand, everybody knows that it's particularly associated with one specific religion, and that its own members, the colonial organization, are members of that religion. So that conflict is obviously very effective in Ireland. It enables all sorts of things to be done that might otherwise run into repression. And Damiloka does the same thing in Burma. He doesn't challenge the British state directly. But as a Buddhist monk, he can defend Buddhism and challenge Christianity. And everybody on both sides knows what's actually at stake. This is why his talking like this is understood as sedition. So that's the trial. That's the context. This is why an Irish Buddhist monk is such a popular figure on the streets of Rangoon. But there's something else going on and we don't quite know. So I'll just tell you what happens afterwards. The authorities are so nervous, they put off the trial, they put off sentencing, and they give him the lightest possible sentence. He's bound over to keep the peace for a year. Yeah? They can't, of course, be seen to actually let him go. But then when that year is up, on the 1st of February, 1912, he leaves Burma. He goes to Singapore, he goes to Australia, where he fakes his own death. Something's happening there, we're not quite sure what. And then, not long after that, after the obituaries have come out, he appears again in a Singapore newspaper office, and he says, "I'm not dead." And then, a year after that again, he disappears, and this time for good. So there's maybe something else going on in the background, though. We don't know what it is. We'd love to find out. So there's a mysterious end. What I want to do now is talk to you a little bit about how on earth did he get there? What is he doing in Rangoon in the first place? So on the right is Booterstown Avenue, where he was born, literally in the shadow of the church, about where the parochial house is now. And if you know Booterstown Avenue, if you go downhill towards the camera in this case. Very short distance from there, you see the railway line. And beyond the railway line is the sea. And if you're mitching off school in the late 1860s, you could be at Kingstown Docks, Dunleary, in an hour, or you could be hanging out watching the ships, chatting to sailors in Ringsend in an hour. So it's not so surprising that when he gets to the point of emigrating, he does so as a sailor. Yeah. He's one of lots of children. Clearly, emigration is written into his future. And somewhere around the age of 15, 16, he heads off. He goes to Liverpool, then to New York. He works his way up and down the coast on a schooner, cargo ships of the day, and then becomes a migrant laborer overland. So he goes to Chicago, goes to Montana, goes to California, winds up in San Francisco, and starts working again as a sailor on the Pacific Mail lines between San Francisco and Yokohama. And somewhere then, at some point, he winds up in Rangoon. That's the picture on the left there. And you can see what a mix it is. There's the new paddle steamers on the right, the very last of the high-speed sail ships on the left, and lots of smaller local craft, and a very, very multi-ethnic population of Indians, Burmese, Chinese, poor whites working those docks. So here's how Damiloka tells that story years and years later. Talking to another hobo, the vagabond journalist, Harry Frank. And they're crossing the Ganges on a ferry. Ganges is extremely wide at this point, Goalanda. And Damiloka is chatting to Harry Frank and another hobo, Rice. And he talks about working his way across America. And they check out, are you really a hobo? Are you just making this up? But he convinces them he knows about blind baggage, which is jumping cargo trains. He understands how to get around the police, the railroad bulls. He knows what the towns are to watch out for. And it even turns out that he and Frank have actually worked on the same boat. So that's one way he tells this story. But there's another way of telling this story that explains maybe a little bit better why, when he finally gets to Rangoon, he converts to Buddhism, because this isn't what we expect from the Irish diaspora in the late 19th century. It's famous, of course, for tight ethnic solidarity, for strong religious identification. So stepping outside of that, becoming a Buddhist, is quite an unusual move. But here's the thing. If you look at his journey, you find that it's a journey that takes him through one ethnic conflict after another. So the Liverpool docks in the early 1870s, when he gets there, are the scene of riots between English Protestant workers and Irish Catholic workers. And something of that is, of course, still there today in Liverpool on both sides. There are Orange Lodges as well as Liverpool Republicans. He arrives in New York in the period of how the Irish became white, gangs of New York, where the Irish are trying to overcome the discrimination and oppression that's directed at them by directing it elsewhere, towards Italians later on, but at this period, particularly against blacks. And that continues on the road among hobos, because this is the period after the Civil War. And it's a period in which Irish hobos are doing their level best to keep out black hobos. There are very intense conflicts there. Chicago, famously, like New York, another site of Irish organization. And then Montana, where he arrives in the middle of the Indian Wars. So this is just after Red Cloud's War, and it's before the Battle of the Little Bighorn. the conflicts between miners and Indians and the US cavalry. And then moving further west, Irish laborers and Chinese laborers have been working on the railroads. And in San Francisco in particular, the Working Men's Party, led by Carney, is organizing anti-Chinese riots, basically. And the Pacific Mail line that Damiloka works on as a sailor is one of the hot spots, should Chinese be allowed to work on the trans-Pacific sailing ships. So somewhere along this journey, we think, Damiloka refuses to buy into that very closed, tightly defined, defensive, aggressive version of Irishness. And converting to Buddhism, as he does in Rangoon, becoming a Buddhist monk in 1900, makes a lot more sense if we think of this history behind it. One thing that also doesn't change when he arrives in Asia is this business of being a hobo. So I hope you can see this on your screens. The little Dharma wheels there, Buddhist symbols, are different places where we have records of him, mostly organizing. So he's active in Tokyo, in Hong Kong. Down at the bottom right-hand corner, that's Thursday Island in the Torres Straits, just above mainland Australia. And then Singapore, today's Malaysia, Siam, Thailand, Burma, Myanmar, Chittagong in today's Bangladesh, Calcutta, and then Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka, and other places that he may have been, which we haven't put in here, Cambodia perhaps, Nepal or whatever. He's an anti-colonial celebrity. He is famous around Buddhist Asia. So that's quite an extraordinary travel story, but there's one little wrinkle, because I said this is how he tells this story. And we did spend a year trying to track him down in the States. One of the obvious reasons why we couldn't is that he has at least 5 different pseudonyms. He's not just Damiloka and Laurence Carroll. He's also Lawrence O'Rourke. He's William Colvin. He's Captain Daylight, and probably more that we haven't identified, which wasn't at all uncommon for working class men in these days. So 5 is pretty much the average number of pseudonyms for arrest records in San Francisco in this period, which of course is why this is also the period that sees the rise of mugshots, the rise of fingerprinting, the rise of the detective story and so on. Who are these people? Who is this particular troublemaking Irishman? And the thing that's particularly interesting in view of his political career in Asia is that, if you've been following, there's a sort of 25-year gap there. We see him arriving in New York in 1872, and he says he took a couple of years to get across America. And then we don't see him again until he's ordained in Rangoon in 1900. So what was he up to? And particularly, why didn't he talk about it? Because this is somebody who loved to tell stories about himself. It's somebody who lived through telling stories. And one possibility, it's just one possibility, is that the States is where he learned how to do politics. But he learned how to do it in so radical a way that he felt he'd better keep quiet about it, even once he was on the other side of the world, in a world that didn't have extradition treaties. So the 1870s, it's the period of the decline of the Fenians and the rise of Clan na Gael in the States. It's the period of the Molly Maguires, the secret societies of Irish miners in the coalfields. It's the period of the rise of anarchism, of socialism, of hardline trade unionism. There are general strikes in this period. So one possible guess is that that's where he learned the activist trade, and that's why he didn't really want to talk about what happened between, say, 1875 and 1900 in any great detail. There are other ways you could tell that story, but that's one. So, one way or another, we're certain that he arrives in Rangoon. He gets ordained in 1900 as a Buddhist monk in the Tavoy Monastery in Rangoon, in a very public and elaborate ceremony. But he doesn't really make his name until a year after that, 1901. And he does it at this place, the Schwedigan Pagoda in Rangoon. Now, the Schwedigan is the most holy site for Burmese Buddhists. It has relics not just of the historical Buddha, but of the 3 Buddhas who are supposed to have preceded. It's such a holy site that there are cannon reportedly pointing from the British Army barracks here on the left. You can see within sight of the Schwedigan. There are cannon pointing at it, and it's a meaningful threat to say, if you guys kick off in town, we'll blow up your pagoda. So the connection between religion and power is very, very visceral there. It towers over everything in Rangoon still to this day. And it's an extremely busy place, particularly on festival days. So the Full Moon Festival in 1901, it's crowded like you see in the picture on the right there. There are stalls, there are tourists. You can see there on the right, the white guy with the hat. There are locals, there are Buddhist monks, everybody is there. And in the middle of this is an off-duty policeman walking through the pagoda wearing his shoes. And Damiloka, wearing his Buddhist robes, barefoot, goes up to him and says, you have to take your shoes off if you want to come onto the pagoda. And this is an absolutely dramatic moment that's going to reverberate around Burma for decades afterwards. Why? Well, in Burma, as in lots of Asian countries, shoes are dirty things. So you might remember that Iraqi journalist who threw his shoes at George Bush. The shoes there, they're not just a convenient missile, they're an insult because shoes are dirty. They're what walk on the street. You take them off when you come into people's houses as an absolutely ordinary matter. And you certainly take them off when you go into your own temple or anybody else's temple or pagoda or whatever. It's just what you do. It would be extraordinarily rude not to. So there's a basic issue of respect here. But it's also an issue about race, about who is wearing the shoes. So here are a few comments from Western journalists about just what it was like to see a European become a Buddhist. It was a strange sight to behold a European bowing down to a graven image, and a thrill of astonishment passed through the Europeans present, who had never dreamed such a thing possible. Or it had been hard to know exactly what to expect, hard to give any definition to one's vision of a man of one's own race, dedicated to a religious ideal of the East. Down on the bottom left, this author talks about the wide gulf that Damiloka, in this case, had stepped across on the bridge of his yellow robe. Or on the lower right, where there's a Burmese Buddhist monk ordaining a Western Buddhist. The candidate, kneeling, lifted his head and looked up at them with affection and confidence and docility and submission. That's an important word, submission. Between man and man, indeed a curious regard across this gulf of race and tradition. How is one to write of the strange pang it brought? How indeed. So you can see clothes, submission, bowing down to a graven image, race, religion. These things are all very much bound up with each other, and there's a reason for that. And it looks like this. Back in the 18th century, it wasn't such a big deal if Europeans in Asia had maybe, as a man, had an Asian wife, or converted to a local religion, had local friends, even wore local clothes. They might be seen as a bit eccentric, but it was okay. After the Great Indian Rebellion in 1857, there's a bit of a change. The rebellion isn't the only reason for it, but it's one key reason, because Europeans realized there's really not very many of them, and they're in the most populous continent on Earth. So how do you deal with the fragility of colonial power? Well, one way you deal with it is to try and make being a European a special, different thing. And that has to do with proper clothing, keeping your distance from the natives, proper behavior, all the things, of course, that somebody who bows down to a graven image, who submits to an Asian religious hierarchy, who shaves their head, who goes begging. That's a color line that Western Buddhists are stepping across. And it's a very politically charged line, particularly around shoes. Taking your shoes off is demeaning. There is an exemption for military and police in the performance of their duties, but routinely, as you can imagine, they just wander around there anyway. And all sorts of Western tourists wander across pagodas, go onto pagodas to paint, just treat them as part of the landscape, wearing their shoes, because it would be lowering themselves to the level of the natives to take their shoes off. But from the point of view of a Burmese Buddhist, of course, as Damiloka is reputed to have said, the British had first taken Burma from the Burmans, and now they were trampling on their religion. So wearing shoes, deeply offensive, deep lack of respect from the Buddhist point of view, but a completely non-negotiable thing from the point of view both of whites and of the colonial military and police. They're just not going to budge on that one. And this guy makes an issue of it. And Damiloka gets to go to town on the subject. In fact, this issue is going to run and run up to 1919 and then beyond. It remains one of the key mobilizing issues, in fact, for Burmese nationalism for a couple of decades to come. So Damiloka telling this copper in full view of the most central religious event, or one of the most central public religious events of the year, take those shoes off. But there's another wrinkle in this little story, which is this. I've talked about Westerners becoming Buddhist and breaching the colour line and how problematic that is. But there's a particular problem with the Irish becoming Buddhist. So there on the left is Kim, Kipling's book, an absolute bestseller, including in Ireland, in which the son of an Irish soldier and an Indian woman becomes at the same time the disciple of a Tibetan Buddhist, there he is, but also works for the spy masters of the British Raj. And the whole tension in Kim is, which side is his heart really on? And there on the right, the novel The Road to Mandalay, a very, very similar story. An Irish ex-soldier deserts, becomes a Buddhist monk, and redeems himself by joining the army and dying in World War I. So why are Irish Buddhists fascinating? Well, they're fascinating because the army in India, Burma, and so on is in very large part Irish. And the Irish are, of course, famous for trouble at home. What happens if the Irish in the Indian army, in the army in Burma, stop being loyal? Can we trust the Irish? What if the Irish make alliances with the Buddhists? And you've seen that picture of just how much of Asia is connected by Buddhism. It's a source of deep anxiety. People believe, wrongly as it turns out, but they believe that there are actually more Buddhists than Christians in the world as a whole. So the idea of an Irish Buddhist and an Irish Buddhist confronting this central issue of race at the same time as he is himself transgressing it. Damiloka has put his finger, or rather he's put his feet, on something very, very sensitive indeed. And in the long run, he wins. So here, pretty much a century afterwards, is Obama and Hillary Clinton in their formal clothes, but of course, barefoot on the Schwedigan. So I've told you a couple of stories. I've told you the story of Damiloka on trial for sedition, and how all these different ethnicities in Rangoon come out to support him. I've told you the story of how he gets from Bhutan to Burma, and I've told you the story of shoes. And you can see maybe why he was famous in his day. So in the middle there is a snippet from the Sunday Independent in 1911, our Sunday Independent, in fact, William Martin Murphy's Sunday Independent, where they say, well, it now appears that Reverend U Dhammaloka is an Irish American, meaning that he's traveled through America, whose real name is Lawrence O'Rourke, a native of Dublin, who before he became converted to the Buddhist belief whilst in Rangoon, was successively a sailor, tramp, shepherd, truckman, stevedore, and tally clerk. And it goes on, that's just the start of it. So he's famous in Ireland. On the left, there's a picture from an illustrated magazine, a Calcutta magazine called The Empress, of all things. And a rather different, livelier photo of him. I suspect in this case, he thought the photographer had finished taking the photo because he's not half so posed as he is in the photo you saw at the start. And on the right, this is from the San Francisco Examiner, an artist's impression of Damiloka. I'll read the caption for you. A double row of dark-haired maidens extended for nearly a mile along the dusty road, and the American Buddhist strode over their flowing hair. Fascinating stuff, yeah. And maybe not such a great artist because the dark-haired maidens look rather more like American flappers, and the Buddhist in question looks rather more like Dracula than anything else. But there you go. Damiloka in this period was well known. In fact, he also appeared in children's adventure books. But by the time Alicia, Brian, and myself came to start researching this, he'd been completely forgotten. So why is that? Well, the main reason we think is that he just didn't fit the stories that either Burmese or Irish nationalism told about itself later. So you saw there in 1911, you still get a very multi-ethnic crowd supporting this Irish Buddhist. And in fact, his key supporter in all of this is a guy called P.J. Mehta, who is one of Gandhi's closest associates. So he's one of the radicals of the Indian National Congress. He's an Indian nationalist in Rangoon, working with those Indian Muslim dock workers, supporting this Irish Buddhist as a key element of opposition to colonialism. But of course, as we know, if you crack open today's newspapers, Burmese nationalism has become associated with a very exclusivist form of ethno-religious identification. To be a proper member of the Burmese nation is to be Buddhist, and all sorts of ethnic conflicts around the realities of the Burmese state. And if you tell that kind of story, well, there's no real space for P.J. Mehta there, and there's no real space for Laurence Carroll in that particular story. And of course, something rather similar happened in Ireland. So from the world of Protestant, Catholic and dissenter, Irish nationalism has become increasingly associated with Catholicism, even in Damiloka's own day. But still, you can see in 1911, even William Martin Murphy is happy to tell this particular story as an anti-colonial one, as some form of connection. By the 30s and the 40s, the idea of an Irish person converting to Buddhism as in opposition to the British Empire is not one that fits with the story that we want to tell. And so on both sides, this kind of story gets forgotten. But part of the reason I think why it's maybe worth telling these stories again, excavating them, sharing them round, is that by 2021, 110 years on, I'm so sorry, maybe these other sorts of stories, these other histories about what it means to be Irish, what it means to be Burmese, how we think of empire, how we think of religion, how we think of the diaspora, maybe it's worth telling different stories. And maybe those different stories are becoming more interesting, even more relevant again. So I will leave it there. If I can unshare, my apologies, stop share.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was fascinating. A whistle-stop tour to a very interesting life. And I know there's hours more you could have spoken on. We do have a number of questions in already, so I might read them out if you want to address them in turn, if that's okay, if you have a moment. The first is from Emer O'Brien, who has asked, is Captain Daylight derived from Captain Moonlight, the persona of Irish agrarian violence in the late 19th century?
Shall I answer them one at a time, maybe?
Yes, probably be best.
Yeah. I think the short answer is yes. So, as you've said, Captain Moonlight is a common thing that people sign anonymous letters with in rural Ireland in the 18th and 19th century. If the landlords raised the rent or people are getting evicted, it's not uncommon for a note to be delivered, even banged up on the town hall in daylight, saying this has to change or else, signed Captain Moonlight. And he's certainly aware of that kind of thing. He uses it as a pen name when he's writing to the newspapers sometimes, possibly though with this implication that he is actually doing things in full daylight. He is not in fact going around burning down people's hayricks. But there is this slightly social media vibe where you could imagine somebody having a social media account under another name. There's a little bit of that flavor to it as well. But yeah, I think you're right.
Thank you, Lawrence. So Felicity Goodall has asked, how long has Damiloka been in Rangoon before he was ordained? Presumably he would have had to study the Dharma, etc.
Well, this is an extraordinarily good question. And the short answer is that we simply do not know. Technically, at that point, it was entirely possible to get your novice ordination and your full ordination the same day. It seems very unlikely. So what we do see of him by 1900, when he gets ordained, is somebody who's fallen very deeply in love with Burmese and, in fact, other Asian cultures. He's clearly deeply at home there. We're told that he speaks maybe half a dozen different Asian languages, and we actually catch a glimpse of him winning an argument in Hindi Urdu, what was called Hindustani back then. So it's clearly true. He'd been around Asia, he knew Asians, he got on with people, he hadn't just stepped off the boat, let's say. And one of the things that really sets him apart from most of the other Western Buddhists of his day is that he's actually able to live in the monastery fully according to the local rules. So he's able to do everything that the local monks do. And this is one reason why he's so popular among ordinary Burmese people. So just to give you a sense of that, when he's on tour, it's like a rock star on tour. Yeah, so he goes to these small towns in rural Burma, and people will travel for 2 or 3 days to go and see him. They'll come in ox carts, they'll walk on foot. There are crowds of thousands there to see him. And this is because they regard him as somebody who is absolutely embodying what a Buddhist monk should be. Yeah. He is a very proper exemplar of the Buddhist monk, as well, of course, as very dramatically contrasting everything that people are told about modernity, colonialism, Christianity, and so on. So yeah, he's been there for a while. We don't know how long he's been in the monastery, but probably for some time.
Thank you, Lawrence. And Felicia's also asked where his monastery was located. Was it in Tavoy or that way?
So, okay, yeah. So Dawei or Tavoy, for people who don't know, it's a town well down the coast, roughly halfway between Rangoon and Singapore, in fact. And it's another diasporic minority. So Tavoyans are famous as sailors in particular. And he's at the Tavoy Monastery in Rangoon. So this is a monastery that's particularly open initially, obviously, when it was created for people of that ethnic minority, but then by extension for sailors. And we find that there are all sorts of sailors there. So when that same vagabond journalist turns up at this monastery, he meets another white Buddhist monk who's got tattoos of naked women all down his arm, because he's an ex-sailor. There's a black guy going around in a shredded jumper, and no doubt all sorts of Asians who that white journalist simply doesn't recognize as sailors. And he's with the Tavoyans as well in Bangkok. So he sets up a bilingual school in Bangkok, which is still there, in what at the time is called Wat Ban Tawai. Apologies for my pronunciation. But it is the Tavoyan monastery in Bangkok. And there are Tavoyan links as well to the place that he works in Penang. So clearly there is a whole diasporic network there that he connects with. And we don't really know as much about this as we would like. I want to say it's not for want of trying.
Great, thank you. So from Emer O'Brien, was the Catholic Church seen to be largely pro-British during the 19th century, i.e. before the Catholic nationalist narrative?
Well, I'm not going to attempt to answer that for Ireland. What I can say is that when we are looking at Irish Catholics and indeed other Catholics in Asia, their response to Damiloka is universally hostile. So the trial that I start with, it starts from speeches that he delivered in Moulmein in southeast Burma, where there is a St. Patrick's school, obviously an Irish Catholic school, which is struggling, among other things, with the fact that lots of its Burmese pupils have set off to create student Buddhist associations. And if you think of the worst sort of Christian brother headmaster, faced with all these native boys who've suddenly decided that they want to have a Buddhist association in their school, you can see that kind of tension. And similarly, when he arrives in Ceylon, for example, we see the Catholic press deeply, deeply hostile to him. And some of that's probably coming from his own experience in two ways. So one is, I said, he literally grows up in the shadow of the church. The church is set back from the road. His house was in front of it. So that's not a neutral place to be. As a boy in late 19th century Ireland, we know nothing about what the relationship was like, but evidently he did not come out of it a good, pious Catholic. He came out of it, as many working class Irishmen did, deeply anti-clerical. And in the States, he becomes, like Lafcadio Hearn, he becomes an atheist. And a lot of the arguments that he uses against Christianity are atheist arguments. So they're Western atheist arguments designed to show, for example, well, maybe Christianity isn't so compatible with science as all that. Because the logic of colonialism is, we're bringing you modernity, we're bringing you the railways, the postal system, we're bringing you health and medicine and education, and we're bringing you the gospel. And of course, by challenging the link between religion and modernity, Damiloka's putting his finger on another fault line there.
Great, thank you, Lawrence. Another attendee has asked, how was he rediscovered and why the name U Dhammaloka, the meanings behind it? Any thoughts?
Okay, well, I'll answer the simple question first and then the slightly more complicated one. Simple question, U is just an honorific. It's what they translate there sometimes as reverend. So his ordained name is Damiloka, and it means something like light of the Dharma being the Buddhist teaching. So it's a fairly obvious name to give to somebody who you want to go out to become a very public preacher, which is what Damiloka is. So how we rediscovered him? Well, Alicia came across him, found a footnote mentioning an Irish Buddhist and thought, well, this is interesting. On one side of the Atlantic, we didn't know each other at this point. Around the same time, I was doing the history of Irish Buddhists and came across this Kentucky Atheist magazine, which had got a letter from a Buddhist priest who was saying, you guys think Tom Paine is the business. We think Tom Paine is the business over here in Burma. I was kind of skeptical when I read that letter. I thought, this Kentucky atheist, he's just made up this Buddhist guy to suit his story. But here is my little Easter egg, if I can show it to you very briefly. On eBay, I then found this envelope sent from his Buddhist Tract Society, postmarked Rangoon, and went, okay, no, this actually was real. This guy really existed. And then Brian Bocking, who kind of set up the academic study of religions in Ireland and Cork, put the two of us in contact with each other. So that was back in about 2009. And we spent sort of 10 years between us, so sort of 30 people years, trying to reassemble all the pieces of this story across all those different countries and indeed continents.
Great, thanks, Lawrence. Two more from Felicity that I might combine. So the first is, do we know anything about his white contacts in Burma, or indeed if there were any? And second, did he speak in the Shan States or mainly just in Lower Burma?
Did you say white context?
Yes, white contacts. So I suppose other Europeans or North Americans live there.
So he definitely speaks in central Burma. He speaks in Arakan, and I won't go into it in great detail, but he's got a particular link with a Shan chieftain So he forms an alliance for events in Thailand with the Sao, apologies for my pronunciation, of Keng Tong. So there is a very specific Shan link there, which again, it will be fantastic to know more about. In terms of his European context, we really don't see very much of this. He's not an expat. As you've seen already from the States, he's not the kind of guy who just wants to hang out with Irish people and reminisce about the good old days and go, oh, who are you related to? He's the opposite of that. Insofar as we do see him with anybody, it's with these other poor whites, because what the empire really generates is this whole flotsam of ex-sailors, ex-soldiers, all sorts of odd categories like horse grooms and so on, ex-domestic servants, who at a certain point are cut adrift and they are kicking around Asia. They haven't gone there as drifters, they've gone there to work. But now they're stuck there, if indeed they feel stuck, and Damiloka is clearly the kind of person who doesn't feel stuck at all. He's the kind of person who very happily goes native and doesn't seem to feel any particular need to be around other Europeans for the sake of doing so. It's really not what he spends his life doing. He spends his life hooking up with one crowd, a Chinese merchant in Singapore, this Shan chieftain, a Sri Lankan Buddhist leader, Japanese reformist Buddhist. That's what he does. That's what we see of him.
Great. I think you may already have addressed then a couple more of the questions remaining, but we first, anyway, Mark O'Connor asked, did Damiloka ever leverage his Irish heritage in his later life? And then Morris asks, did he ever talk about Ireland during his time in Burma? So,
okay. So I'll start with Morris's question because it's an interesting one, and he doesn't. And it's not fully clear to me whether the reason for that is that he's really trying to avoid anything that could be more politically treasonous, or maybe because that is the part of his past that he wants to draw a veil over for whatever reason, because he'd been a Fenian, let's say, or because his time in Ireland maybe had been very traumatic, even abusive. We just don't know. But it's not something that we find him telling stories about, even though he's clearly happy to tell people where he's from. So we do see this where he's leveraging his Irish identity to a certain extent. So that newspaper editor in Singapore, Edward Morphy, who edits the Straits Times, a guy from Killarney, he's the guy who tells us that Damiloka comes from Blackrock or Booterstown or whatever, which is part of what enabled us to really nail down this identification with Laurence Carroll from Booterstown Avenue, which of course is and was postally in Blackrock. So you see that kind of conversation happening. Or there's another story where a policeman gets rather upset because Damiloka has come back from Japan with this black robe that he's been given by a Japanese abbot. And he's trying to get a rickshaw or whatever, and this policeman thinks he's a priest, thinks he's an Irish priest, so gives him some money for a fare. And then later on is righteously offended to find out that he's a priest, all right, but he's not that kind of priest. So little snippets like that, definitely. And clearly, when he does bump into the Irish, they recognize him as Irish. There's no doubt about that.
Great. I think we might just address maybe two more questions and we can wrap up. John Quinn has asked, do we know anything about his ultimate death? Which I think is a pretty timely question.
We wonder about it. Okay, so I'd said that he appears, he fakes his death from Australia, or we think it's him who fakes his death. The obituaries go around the world. And then he turns up in the Singapore newspaper and says, no, I'm not dead. And then he kind of goes off stage for a while and comes back months and months later, again in Singapore. And he's talking to Dharmapala, the Sri Lankan Buddhist leader, and they're talking very confidently about Damiloka coming to speak in Ceylon, as was the following year. So that's October 1913. I'm pretty sure we'd know if he'd done it, or even if he'd said he'd do it and he backed out, because Dharmapala kept great diaries, we would have heard. So for whatever reason, that doesn't happen. He had been in ill health. Maybe he just died. And of course, one of the things that is on the horizon after October 1913 is World War I. So given that newspapers had already published his obituary and they've got something else to talk about, maybe it did happen publicly. Or maybe, you know, he just changed his name, went on to a new life somewhere else. Maybe he even went back to Ireland. Yeah, married his old childhood sweetheart and settled down in a little whitewashed cottage. I don't think so, but you genuinely can, you know, come up with the story that you like. We don't know.
Great, thanks, Lawrence. I suppose I'll just address two more questions, but one's quite brief. Do you know which timber company that Damiloka worked for when he originally arrived? No, that's fine.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
And then from Simon Dawson, you partly answered this, atheism, but what were the main arguments he put forward in his preaching tours and tracts? I suppose speaking more to the religious content of his sermons as opposed to the kind of anti-imperialist elements.
Well, there's all sorts of stuff. So one of the things that came up in his trial was a statement that there were lots of babies dying in convents and being buried in quicklime, which is a rather startling thing to read, or rediscover in my case, the week after the Mother and Baby report came out. Now, I don't think in that case he was referring to Ireland. I think he was referring to more general atheist comments along the lines of charges around the witch trials and so on. So there'd be that kind of stuff around the social record of Christianity, and particularly about the link of Christianity with violence. So he's deeply, deeply opposed to violence. Like many people in the period, he thinks of Buddhism very strongly as a religion of peace. And he says, look, it's not an accident that the Bible and the Gatling gun are going together. So that's a big theme. But I think the thing that he likes the most for himself is arguments about science and knowledge. So he says, look, the Bible tells you there'll be angels at the four corners of the earth. The earth is a globe. Yeah, it's pretty much what he says. And he's a sailor, he's literally sailed around it. How could you say that this stuff is compatible with science? There's an awful lot of stuff like that. And in this period, Buddhists are very keen on saying Buddhism is a rational religion. It doesn't depend on belief in virgin birth. It doesn't depend on belief in miracles, and so on and so forth. Whereas the Bible that we're being asked to take literally comes with all these stories that are manifestly nonsensical. So he loves that kind of argument. He's clearly very good at it. And we catch little snippets of him arguing with missionaries. He's clearly so good at it that after the first of these, they really back off. Evidently, the word goes around, don't have debates with this guy, because, you know, people did have these religious debates, but they stopped debating him after a while because clearly he wins.
Brilliant, thanks, Lawrence. I suppose just one final question and then we'll leave it there. Jill Wilde has asked, she's interested in the notion of groupthink and wonders, is this what you were referring to when you explain why the story and others like it were lost because they didn't fit with the narrative? Do you think groupthink is an issue in Irish society today? I suppose that's a broader question, but maybe just in the context of forgotten narratives, if you want to just address that.
Well, I mean, maybe just to bring it back then to the work that's being done here in the Emigration Museum and elsewhere. And I think the work that an awful lot of people, historians and others are doing around the world is trying to have a more open sense of what it is to be Irish, a more generous, diverse, inclusive sense in which we can come across a story like this and go, oh, that's interesting. that enriches our sense of what it means to be Irish, rather than this is a threat to that. And I think that's important, clearly, for all sorts of reasons. It's important in Ireland. It's also very evidently important in the States. You know, we've seen Irish Americans involved in American politics in very, very different ways. So I think these kinds of stories are helpful to us in having a more generous, more open sense of what it means to be Irish and what the Irish diaspora is and can be.
Thank you, Lawrence. That's fantastic. I think we'll leave it there. I will encourage anyone else who has attended tonight that has further questions to pick up a copy of the book, of course, and might probably be addressed there, available in all good bookshops. And just to offer our thanks again to Lawrence for a fabulous discussion this evening. Great to see such an engaged audience as well. And to remind anyone else who may be interested, the next lecture here at the museum will be on the 18th of February, and it will look at the Irish Jewish and Irish Jewish diasporas. So speaking about those broader narratives that aren't always as widely known, you're all welcome to attend. Further details are on our website, epicchq.com as well. So thank you again, Dr. Cox, for joining us. And if anyone else wants to get in touch, I'm sure your contact details are available online.
Absolutely.
If they have specific questions. So thank you, everybody. Hope to see you all again soon, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.